Keeping up with NFL draft season, I decided to make a video where I looked at the best draft class for every NFL franchise in their history. The video begins right after this. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, DraftKings Pick 6. Basketball fans, we've seen some incredible action on the court as we head into the heart of the NBA season. The games are getting even more intense, and with so many high-stakes matchups ahead, you won't want to miss out. Right now, you can get in on the action with my partners at DraftKings Pick 6, a fresh, exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All new customers who play just $5 will get $50 in Pick 6 credits to keep you in the game. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app now and sign up with code BARRY to claim your offer. This is your shot to level up your NBA experience only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Getting started is simple. Just download the DraftKings Pick 6 app and sign up with code BARRY. Pick at least 2 players and choose if they'll have more or less of a stat, like will they score 20 or more points or have 3 or more assists. Lock them in and compete against others for a shot at huge cash prizes. So download the DraftKings Pick 6 app now and sign up with code BARRY only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Starting off with the Arizona Cardinals, 2004. The 2004 draft saw the Cardinals take their best player in franchise history at Larry Fitzgerald, but also Carlos Dansby, who played 13 plus seasons in the NFL and was a big part of the Cardinals' run to the Super Bowl in 2008, as was Darnell Dockett, who they took in the 3rd round, who went on to play in 3 Pro Bowls in his long career. And they also drafted later on Antonio Smith, the defensive end, who ended up making a Pro Bowl. So despite the Cardinals' lack of relative historical success, this draft was actually a little bit better than some other franchises' best drafts ever, as you'll see pretty shortly. The Atlanta Falcons, 2008. The crown jewel of the Falcons' 2008 draft class was obviously quarterback Matt Ryan, who went on to make 4 Pro Bowls and win MVP in 2016, while also being a 15-year starter in the league and a potential Hall of Famer. But the real reason for all of these drafts in this video, making this video, is because of the depth of the classes, not necessarily them being top-heavy. Curtis Lofton was a respectable player for the Falcons. Harry Douglas had some moments. Thomas DeCloud was a Pro Bowler and a longtime starter for the Falcons as well. And Croy Bierman was also a respectable starter. And they all came in this draft, which is really what the Falcons needed at this particular point in time in 2008, because that was when Michael Vick was just lost to the dogfighting scandal. And a large portion of the guys from this draft, especially Ryan, were the reason why they came within 1/4 of winning the franchise's only Super Bowl championship. But we're not going to talk about that. We're moving on right now. Baltimore Ravens, 1996. This is a pretty easy one. In their first ever draft as a franchise after moving from Cleveland, in their first 2 picks, they selected 2 Hall of Famers. Yes. Jonathan Ogden, 4th overall, went on to be a Hall of Fame offensive lineman at the offensive tackle position, 11 Pro Bowls and 4 first-team All-Pros. But the crown jewel was obviously Ray Lewis, the 26th overall pick. He made 12 Pro Bowls and was a 7-time first-team All-Pro, as well as a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year and a Super Bowl MVP, and he also racked up 2 kills. In addition to that, as if that wasn't good enough, they also selected Jermaine Lewis, who was a big part of their special teams in their Super Bowl run in 2000. He made 2 Pro Bowls and a first-team All-Pro as a special teamer. If you want to know why the Ravens won a Super Bowl relatively early in their career as a franchise, you can look right back to this draft. Buffalo Bills, 1985. Let's start off with the obvious. The Bills in 1985 selected 2 Hall of Famers, including the all-time sack leader and Bruce Smith with the 1st overall pick. Smith went on to 11 Pro Bowls and 8 first-team All-Pros. He also was a Defensive Player of the Year. But they also selected a Hall of Fame wide receiver in Andre Reed with the 86th overall pick. Reed went on to make 7 Pro Bowls. They also snuck in Frank Reich, who went on to be known for the greatest comeback in postseason NFL history with his 32-point comeback versus the Oilers in 1992. This is a draft that had 2 cornerstones. I wouldn't say Frank Reich was a cornerstone, but he was a part of the Bills making 4 straight Super Bowls in the early 90s, and we all know they lost all 4 of them, but still, nobody has duplicated that. The Chiefs have a chance to do that again this upcoming season, but still, nobody in the Super Bowl era has made 4 straight Super Bowls other than the 1990 to 93 Bills, and the 85 draft was a big reason why. Carolina Panthers, 2001. It's ironic, the 2001 Panthers draft is the best because in 2001, the Panthers went 1-15, but their top 3 picks were a hell of a trio. Dan Morgan suffered from injury problems for all of his career, but when he was rarely healthy, he was a great player. He did make a Pro Bowl and was a starter for 5 seasons. Chris Jenkins went on to be a multi-time All-Pro at the defensive tackle position and a 4-time Pro Bowler. And then, obviously, the crown jewel of the draft was Steve Smith Sr. Smith Sr. obviously is an incredible respecter of the sacrament of marriage, as we all know recently. He ended up making 5 Pro Pro Bowls and 2 first-team All-Pros. He won the NFL's Triple Crown in 2005, leading the league in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. And he's also a great postseason receiver, despite never winning any championship. Oh, and even though his recent off-field transgressions might be what he's most known for, he probably should be in the Hall of Fame. After that, the draft dried up a little bit, but still, you're not going to find many drafts where a team hits on the top 3 picks like that. Chicago Bears, 1983. The story of the 1983 draft for the Bears is depth. Now, they also didn't do too bad at the top end, as they drafted 2 Hall of Famers. Jimbo Covert with the 6th overall pick from Pittsburgh. He went on to be a multi-time All-Pro and Pro Bowler, although his career was cut short by injuries. I would say the best pick of their draft was Richard Dent in the 8th round, as Richard Dent went on to become another Hall of Famer. He made 4 Pro Bowls and was a first-team All-Pro and was the Super Bowl MVP for the legendary 85 Bears when they dismantled the Patriots in Super Bowl 20. But that's just the top 2. You look at the other names on this list: Willie Gault, Mike Richardson, Dave Durson, Mark Bortz. There's so many other guys that were starters or important players on those 85 Bears that won the Super Bowl and the rest of the mid to late 80s Bears teams when they were contenders. So if you want to talk about going from a relatively below average team, which is what the Bears were in the mid to early 80s, you can change it around with one draft like this and you become one of the best teams in the league for half a decade, including bringing home a Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl that Chicago has seen. Cincinnati Bengals, 2001. This was actually an incredible draft for a team that was as bad for as long as the Bengals were. Their first pick, Justin Smith, went on to make 5 Pro Bowls and was a first-team All-Pro, although his best years did happen to come with the 49ers, to be fair. Still, they then drafted Chad Johnson, or Chad Ochocinco, who was a 6-time Pro Bowler and 2-time first-team All-Pro. He was one of the best receivers in the league for the better part of a decade in the 2000s. Not a Hall of Famer, but pretty darn close in the Hall of Very Good. Rudy Johnson was a big-time running back for them for a couple years, and he made a Pro Bowl. And then finally, in the 7th round, they snagged TJ Who's Your Mama. He ended up making another Pro Bowl and was a long-time starter. Who knows? Maybe this core of players, if Carson Palmer had never gotten hurt in 2005, maybe they would have done something special. But still, that individual group of talent, very, very good. Cleveland Browns, 1957. Yes, there was once a time where the Browns were the most feared franchise in the NFL, and their draft in 1957 was a big reason for that. Their first pick was Jim Brown, who is arguably the best football player of all time, even though he might have played against plumbers. He made 9 Pro Bowls in 9 years and was an 8-time first-team All-Pro. Their next pick was a quarterback. Milt Plum was a multiple-time Pro Bowler and a respectable player. Henry Jordan, their third pick, was a defensive tackle. He's another Hall of Famer. He made 4 Pro Bowls and 5 first-team All-Pros. And then a little while later, down the draft, they drafted another Hall of Fame offensive lineman in Gene Hickerson, who made 6 Pro Bowls and 3 first-team All-Pros. But they weren't done yet. They drafted Laverne Torkson in the 18th round, and he ended up becoming a Pro Bowl and All-Pro in his own right, in addition to drafting decent starters like Don Gillis and Gene Cockrell. This was the mother lode for the Cleveland Browns in 1957, and looking back at it now, I'm surprised they didn't win more championships after this. They did win it all in 1964, and then after 1965, Jim Brown retired. But still, this was a hell of a class, even if a lot of people nowadays might not remember anybody besides Jim Brown. Dallas Cowboys, 1964. Some of you might think, oh, it has to be one of those draft classes from the early 90s that they got from the Herschel Walker trade. Well, no, sir, it's not. In fact, the Cowboys' longest string of success was easily from the mid-60s to the early 80s, and this draft was a big part of that foundation. They drafted 3 Hall of Fame. Mel Renfro, defensive back, made 10 Pro Bowls. Bob Hayes, Bullet Bob Hayes, the Olympic track star, made 3 Pro Bowls, 2 first-team All-Pros as a Hall of Famer. Jake Cupp was a guard who made a Pro Bowler, but really the crown jewel of this class, as any class is when it comes to the quarterback position, was Roger Staubach, who made 6 Pro Bowls. Surprisingly, was never named first-team All-Pro, but he led the Cowboys to 2 Super Bowls and was named a Super Bowl MVP. He's widely considered, or at least largely considered by many, to be the best quarterback of the 1970s. Now, the one thing with Staubach is that he didn't become a starter until about 5 or 6 years after he was drafted because of his naval duties, or else maybe the Cowboys would have won a couple more Super Bowls with him under center. But still, a class with 3 Hall of Famers and a couple other solid starters, that's how you have a run that makes you become America's team, at least in the minds of a lot of people. Denver Broncos, 1975. The Broncos had one of the weaker best draft classes. You have to remember, basically all of their best quarterbacks, John Elway and Peyton Manning, were drafted by the Colts. But in 1975, they didn't do too bad for themselves. Their first pick, Lewis Wright, went on to make 5 Pro Bowls and was a multi-time All-Pro player. And then Rick Upchurch, in the 4th round, 95th overall pick, made 4 Pro Bowls and 3 All-Pro teams as a receiver, and he's one of the best special teams players of all time. They also drafted longtime starters Reuben Carter and Steve Foley later on in the draft for a very, very respectable draft that made them known as the Orange Crush. They made a Super Bowl in 1977 with a lot of these guys, and then the Elway era was ushered in shortly after that. Detroit Lions, 1951. Much like the Browns, there was once a time where the Lions were a feared and respected organization in the NFL. Now, to be fair, they have turned it around the last couple seasons, but in 1951, I think they had their best draft class of all in terms of depth. We all know about Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson, but in 1951, they drafted 2 Hall of Famers and a bunch of longtime starters, including 4 Pro Bowlers overall. Dick Stanfel, an offensive lineman, made 5 first-team All-Pros and is in the Hall of Fame. Dorn Dibble, that's a fucking 1950s name if I ever heard one, was a respectable starter. Jim Doran, another end, was a Pro Bowler and a longtime starter. Laverne Torgson was a 3-time Pro Bowler and a longtime starter. But the crown jewel of the draft was Jack Christensen, a defensive back, a 6-time first-team All-Pro, Hall of Famer. I know a lot of people listening to this haven't even heard of him, but he was the best player in franchise history, probably along with Bobby Lane, until Barry Sanders came around. And the draft dried up pretty much after that, but still, that's about 4 or 5 really respectable players, and why the Lions would go on to win the NFL championship in the 50s. The Green Bay Packers, 1958. We all love Vince Lombardi and think he was a great coach, and he was, but the draft that the Packers had the year before he got there was a large reason why his teams were probably good, as they drafted 3 Hall of Famers and 5 All-Pros. So it wasn't as if Lombardi was working with a bare cupboard. Jim Taylor, Hall of Famer. Ray Nitschke, Hall of Famer. Jerry Kramer was just inducted into the Hall of Fame a couple years ago. Obviously, they were all All-Pros. Dan Curry, linebacker, was an All-Pro as well, their first pick. Dick Christie was a Pro Bowler. And Ken Gray, another guard, was a 6-time Pro Bowler and an All-Pro who is not in the Hall of Fame. These are all in the same draft. Overall, they drafted 5 All-Pros and 3 Hall of Famers. Not bad at all. Houston Texans, 2006. Again, the Texans, they're a relatively young franchise. They've been around for, 25 years almost now. So there aren't a lot of legendary draft classes to choose from in their respect. So I went with 2006, where they drafted Mario Williams first overall. He went on to become a 4-time Pro Bowler and an All-Pro, although he made that All-Pro team with the Buffalo Bills. D'Amico Ryans, that name is probably familiar. He went on to become another Pro Bowler, and he's now currently the head coach for the team, but he had a very respectful career. Eric Winston had a long career, even though he never made any Pro Bowls or All-Pros. Owen Daniels was a very good tight end as well, had a long career, made 2 Pro Bowls. So you had about 4 players, 3 players who made a Pro Bowl, you had an All-Pro, you had 4 longtime starters. That's not bad, and it's certainly the best the Texans have to offer through this point. Indianapolis Colts, 1963. I say Indianapolis, but we all know back then they were the Baltimore Colts, and 1963 was a hell of a get for the franchise. All in all, they drafted 5 future Pro Bowlers, 2 future All-Pros, and 2 future Hall of Famers. Bob Vogel was a tackle, picked 5th overall. He was a 10-year starter and made 5 Pro Bowls. John Mackey, their second pick, is a Hall of Famer and considered one of the best tight ends of all time. He made 5 Pro Bowls and 3 All-Pro teams, as well as a Super Bowl in 1970. Jerry Logan was a 3-time Pro Bowler, defensive back. Willie Richardson was a flanker back, but he was a Pro Bowler and a first-team All-Pro once. And then Winston Hill, the tackle, another Hall of Famer, was an 8-time Pro Bowler, and you can see why the Colts, who were starting to fall a little bit from their heyday in the 50s, had a resurgence, and this was a big reason why they were able to make it to multiple Super Bowls in the late 60s and early 70s, and win one, as I mentioned before, in 1970. Jacksonville Jaguars, 2016. This might be a little bit of a top-heavy selection, but hey, it's the Jacksonville Jaguars. Give me a fucking break, okay? Jalen Ramsey, their first pick, is the best pick. He is not necessarily the longest tenured Jaguar ever. I believe he was only there for about 4 years, but still, in his career, he's made 7 Pro Bowls and 3 first-team All-Pros, and he did it with the Jaguars as well. And really, this draft class will always be known for the 2017 season, where they were this close to making it to the Super Bowl. Oh, does that say Miles Jack? Oh, well, certainly he wasn't down, was he? On that fumble in the 4th quarter of the 2017 AFC Championship game? Oh, but they ruled he was, so I guess he was. Anyway, he was a 7-year starter, never made a Pro Bowl, was respectable. Yannick Ngakoue is a Pro Bowler and has had a very, very good career. You can see with that young core of those top 3 picks why the Jaguars defense suddenly became very, very good, although it was to be short-lived because the Jaguars can't have anything nice. That's just how it goes. There really wasn't anything else to speak of for the rest of their draft, but those 3 guys were a big part of one of the most memorable defenses of the last 10 years. Kansas City Chiefs, 1963. I was tempted to just use the 17 draft when they drafted Patrick Mahomes to say, hey, guess what? This guy's the best ever. But I had to go with 1963 because they drafted multiple Hall of Famers. They drafted 7 future Pro Bowlers and 4 future All-Pros. Buck Buchanan, their first overall pick, was a Hall of Famer, made 8 Pro Bowls and 4 first-team All-Pros. Their second pick, Ed Budd, was a 7-time Pro Bowler and a multi-time All-Pro. Their next 2 picks after that, Walt Rock and Don Brum, were both Pro Bowlers. Fast forward down, George Sames was a 5-time Pro Bowler and a 3-time first-team team All-Pro. And then probably the crown jewel of the class was Bobby Bell, the linebacker, one of the best linebackers ever. He was a 9-time Pro Bowler and a 6-time first team All-Pro. But they weren't done. Later on in the 11th round, which was only the 88th overall pick, which isn't that bad, they drafted Jarrell Wilson at running back. He was a 3-time Pro Bowler. You can see why the Chiefs in the 60s and early 70s were a team to be reckoned with, as they made 2 Super Bowls and 1 Super Bowl IV versus the Vikings. Las Vegas Raiders, 1968. Obviously, the Las Vegas Raiders weren't around in 1968, but the Oakland Raiders were, and it's the same franchise, so give me a break. In 1968, the Raiders drafted 2 future Hall of Famers in Ken Stabler and Art Shell, and 2 other Pro Bowlers in George Atkinson and Marv Hubbard. Again, like with most of these draft classes, a lot of these teams, their best runs in franchise history are because of the draft. And the Raiders, their run from the late 60s to the early 80s, that's why they are this iconic NFL franchise, even though they haven't done jack shit since the mid-80s, really, outside of that 3-year span in the early 2000s where they got blown out in a Super Bowl, and also the Tuck rule, which is unfair. But you drafted a Hall of Fame quarterback, you drafted one of the best tackles of all time. George Atkinson was a Pro Bowl defensive back. Marv Hubbard was a Pro Bowl running back. Charlie Smith was also a respectable running back as well. I mean, that's just how it goes. It's a great draft. Los Angeles Chargers, 1975. Again, this draft is about depth. I almost went with 2001 because they drafted Drew Brees and LaDainian Tomlinson, but Drew Brees, as we all know, the majority of his career he did with the Saints, so I couldn't do that. This one had just too much depth to ignore. Gary Johnson, their first pick, was a 4-time Pro Bowl and 2-time first-team All-Pro. Mike Williams, the second pick, was a starter for almost a decade. Louis Kelcher was a 3-time Pro Bowler and a first-team All-Pro. Fred Dean is in the Hall of Fame. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler and a 2-time first-team All-Pro. Then you had guys like Mike Fuller, Billy Shields, Ricky Young, who were all long-time starters as well. And the one thing you'll notice is that despite being known in this era for basically being Air Coryell, a lot of these picks are on the defensive side of the ball, which makes me wonder why their defenses weren't better when they had Dan Fouts and Wes Chandler and John Jefferson and Colin Winslow Sr. and all these great offensive players. But either way, again, this is the Chargers. I forgot that, so they can never have anything nice. But still, what a great draft. Los Angeles Rams, 1945. So yeah, I had to go pretty far back in time for this one. And I'll be honest, the reason I chose this one was because the Rams in this time period, they had a absolutely blistering offense, and it was because of Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch and Tom Fears. The combination of those 2 guys, who are both in the Hall of Fame, by the way, at the wide receiver position, as paired with Hall of Fame quarterback Norm Van Brocklin, led to some pretty high-scoring teams. They also drafted 2 other Pro Bowlers with Dick Huffman and Dick Horner. A lot of Dicks back then. And they also had some longtime starters, including well, you know what? I'm not going to say his last name. Moving on. Miami Dolphins, 1968. If you want to know where the Dolphins got most of their firepower for their 3 straight Super Bowl runs in the early 70s and 2 Super Bowl championships, including a perfect season in 1972, look no further than the 1968 draft, where they drafted Larry Zonka and Jim Kick, both at running back position. Zonka is a Hall of Famer, and Kick was one of the best players in the league at his time. They also drafted Dick Anderson, defensive back, who went on to make 3 Pro Bowls and was a multiple-time first-team All-Pro. You combine that with having a Hall of Fame quarterback like Bob Greasy, and it's no wonder the Dolphins were so great in the early 70s. Minnesota Vikings, 1967. Crown jewel of this draft class is obviously Alan Page, a Hall of Famer and former MVP. He made 9 Pro Bowls and a 5 first-team All-Pro guy, but he was not alone in this draft. Vikings also drafted Gene Washington, who made 2 Pro Bowls, Bob Grimm, another receiver who made a Pro Bowl, and Bobby Bryant, a defensive back who made 2 Pro Bowls in the 7th round, 167 overall. Again, when you talk about the purple people eaters, Alan Page is considered by many to be the best of that bunch, and this is where they got him. And they never were able to win a Super Bowl, but they were one of the best teams in the league in the late 60s and the 70s because of guys like Alan Page. New England Patriots, 1995. Now, again, much like with Kansas City, I was extremely tempted to just put 2000 because of Tom Brady, but the rest of the draft in 2000 for the Patriots was not good at all, so fuck Tom Brady. Anyway, so in 1995, the Patriots, and it's not like this is a bad draft by any means either. I mean, they drafted 2 Hall of Famers in Ty Law and Curtis Martin, although to be fair, Curtis Martin did most of his damage with the Jets. They also had Ted Johnson, who was a starter on the Dynasty teams and was on the 96 team as well that went to the Super Bowl. Jimmy Hitchcock was a starter for some time, as was Dave Wollabog at center. He was a 9-year starter. But basically, this gets picked because of the top 3. And Ty Law, people forget this. Ty Law, if not for his pick 6 in Super Bowl 36, I don't think the Patriots would have won. So that's one less ring right there. But yeah, anytime a team drafts multiple Hall of Famers, even if one of those Hall of Famers does most of their damage with another team, it's hard to pick against it. New Orleans Saints, Jets 2017. One of, if not the most recent draft class on this list. This was the latter part of Drew Brees' career that gave his era a bit of a second wind, as every year in the last 4 years of his career, from 2017 to 2020, the Saints were one of the best teams in the league. And the 2017 draft class is a big reason why. Marshawn Lattimore, as we all know, four-time Pro Bowler, hates Mike Evans, but was a big part of their defensive turnaround. Ryan Ramczyk, he's had some injury problems, but he's a former All-Pro at the offensive line. Marcus Williams, longtime starter. Alvin Kamara, five-time Pro Bowler, we all know him, septum piercing. Alex Anzalone has gone on to a respectable career. Trey Hendrickson has gone on to become one of the better defensive ends, or outside linebackers, whichever one you want to call him, in the NFL, although he has had his best seasons with the Bengals and not the Saints. So literally, basically, every draft pick they had was a contributor, and a big reason why they went from a horrible defensive team that missed the playoffs 4 out of 5 years in the mid-2000s to an elite contending team. All he needed to do was give Drew Brees a little bit more help defensively, and they would have been contenders every year of his career, but still, they were a couple bad luck plays and a horrible missed call away from making a Super Bowl with these guys. New York Giants, 1956. In 1956, the Giants drafted Hall of Fame linebacker Sam Huff. They also drafted Jim Katkovich, who was a 3-time Pro Bowler and a 2-time first-team All-Pro. Don Chandler, a fullback, was a Pro Bowler, and Ron Neary was a All-Pro player as well at defensive end, although he didn't play for that long. For as much hype as the Giants get, and I always gleefully point out how overrated they are as a franchise, there aren't that many great draft classes that they've had, and this is the only one I can find that had some sort of depth to it, where you have a Hall of Famer, another All-Pro, and a couple more Pro Bowlers. After Neary in the round 7, the rest of their picks really not much to show for it, except for Jerry Huth, who was a 6-time starter. But yes, this draft was a reason why the Giants were an elite team in the 50s and early 60s. New York Jets, 1977. The 1977 draft for the Jets was pretty damn good. They drafted 3 future All-Pros and 4 future Pro Bowlers and a Hall of Famer in Joe Klecko in the 6th round. Quite possibly the greatest 6th-round pick in NFL history. Marvin Powell, their first pick, was a 5-time Pro Bowler and a 3-time first-team All-Pro. Their second pick, Wesley Walker, at receiver, was a 2-time Pro Bowler and an All-Pro and a long-time starter. But Klecko is the crown jewel, 4-time Pro Bowl and a 2-time first-team All-Pro. He was part of the New York Sack Exchange. Bob Grupp, the punter, made a Pro Bowl. How about that? Good on you, Mr. Grupp. An interesting one here, Dan Alexander, in the 8th round, 200th overall pick, started 13 seasons. So he's another player that they found. Just an overall great draft class for a franchise that really doesn't have much to celebrate. Philadelphia Eagles, 1957. I was tempted to put this year's draft class with the Eagles because guys like Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean have already contributed to a Super Bowl win, but I went with 1957 for now because they drafted 2 Hall of Fame players, Sonny Jurgensen, Hall of Fame quarterback, and Tommy McDonald, a Hall of Fame running back or flanker back, whatever the fuck they used to call him back then in the 50s. They also drafted Billy Ray Barnes, who was a 3-time Pro Bowler. Jurgensen never had any playoff success, but he's widely considered to be one of the most talented quarterbacks ever and is in the Hall of Fame, as I said. He was almost kind of like the Aaron Rodgers of his era in terms of throwing the ball. Tommy McDonald, obviously a 6-time Pro Bowler, and then they had a bunch of other players that were longtime starters, respectable careers. This was a big reason why they won the World Championship in 1960 over the Green Bay Packers, the only playoff loss in Bart Starr and Vince Lombardi's entire careers. Pittsburgh Steelers, 1974. This was the easiest pick in this video, and this is probably the greatest draft class any team has ever had, okay? It's really this simple. In their first 5 picks, the Steelers drafted 4 Hall of Famers. Yes, 4 Hall of Famers in their first 5 picks. And what year was this again? Oh yeah, 1974. And what year and what span did the Steelers win 4 Super Bowls in 6 years? Oh, from 1974 to 1979. Wow, do you think that this draft class might have been a big reason for that? I think so. You drafted 2 Hall of Fame wide receivers with Lynn Swann and John Stallworth. Jack Lambert, Hall of Fame linebacker, 6-time All-Pro. Mike Webster, one of the greatest centers of all time, 9-time Pro Bowler, 5 first-team All-Pro. Then you had other guys. Jimmy Allen was a starter. Charles Davis was a starter as well. And in addition, just as a side note, they also signed a guy named Donnie Shell as an undrafted free agent, and he went on to become a Hall of Famer as well. So the Steelers, in one offseason, acquired 5 future Hall of Famers. That's how you become a dynasty right there. San Francisco 49ers, 1986. The 2 biggest reasons for the 49ers dynasty in the 80s and 90s was because they had back-to-back Hall of Fame quarterbacks in Steve Young and Joe Montana, but do not underestimate their 86 draft in terms of building foundations around their Hall of Fame quarterbacks. They drafted Hall of Famer Charles Haley in the 4th round as the crown jewel of the draft, but they also drafted John Taylor, who became a big part in 3 of their championships. Steve Wallace, as a left tackle, was a Pro Bowler, and he was also a member several multiple championship teams, as was Kevin Fagan and Don Griffin. Tom Rathman was one of the best receiving fullbacks of his era, and he won multiple championships with the 49ers. Basically, the biggest reason why the 49ers in the late 80s were able to repeat was because this was a shot in the arm for them in the draft. Tim McKyer was also another starter. So many players went on to have successful, productive careers with and without the 49ers, and of all the great drafts the 49ers have ever had, this one stands out to me the most for its quality. Seattle Seahawks 2012. This is basically a two-man draft, but we all know the Legion of Boom. We all remember the Seahawks dynasty that was supposed to be that never was, even though they did win a Super Bowl. 2012 is when they went from being just another irrelevant Northwestern team to one of the better teams in the league, and it's because of two drafts picks, Bobby Wagner and Russell Wilson. Bobby Wagner's a 10-time Pro Bowler and a 6-time first-team All-Pro. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame someday, but Russell Wilson is the crown jewel of this draft. He will probably be in the Hall of Fame someday, and if he does make the Hall of Fame, which I think he will, it's going to be on the back of what he did with Seattle. He's a 10-time Pro Bowler, and he put up some of the best statistics of any quarterback in NFL history while with the Seahawks, although he did have one very, very unfortunate interception in the Super Bowl. But when you draft two Hall of Famers in the top 75 picks in the same draft, that's how you turn your franchise around. Bruce Irvin was also a big contributor on the defensive line. Jeremy Lane had an interception in the Super Bowl, although his career was cut short, and J.R. Sweezy had a respectable career as well. But Bobby Wagner and Russell Wilson is a hell of a top two. Tampa Bay Buccaneers. While Bobby Wagner and Russell Wilson is pretty good, it doesn't get much better than nailing two Hall of Fame picks in your first two picks in the same draft, which is what the Buccaneers did in 95, and both on the same side of the ball, with Warren Sapp and Derek Brooks. Sapp was a 7-time Pro Bowler and a 4-time first-team All-Pro, also a Defensive Player of the Year. Derek Brooks was an 11-time Pro Bowler and a 5-time first-team All-Pro, and also a Defensive Player of the Year in 2002, and they were obviously a huge reason why the Buccaneers and their legendary defense were able to win it all in 2002, and they're also a huge reason why, and as well as with other players like John Lynch and Rondé Barber and some other great defensive players, Simeon Rice, that the Buccaneers became one of the most feared defenses in the league for the better part of a decade in the late 90s, early 2000s. Although the rest of the draft doesn't have much after Derek Brooks, when you draft two of the best defensive players ever in the same draft, you make the list. Tennessee Titans, 1967. Now, obviously there were no Tennessee Titans back in 1967. They were the Houston Oilers, and the Oilers did well. Their first pick, George Webster, was a 3-time Pro Bowler and first-team All-Pro member at linebacker. They drafted Zeke Moore, who was a 2-time Pro Bowler at defensive back, but their best and crown jewel of the draft came in the 9th round with the 214th overall pick when they selected Hall of Famer Ken Houston, a 12-time Pro Bowler and a 2-time first-team All-Pro member. Guys like Larry Carwell, Willie Parker, Pete Barnes, and Woody Campbell were also contributors. So this was a draft class that had a Hall of Famer, so it was very good at the top, multiple All-Pros, multiple Pro Bowlers, and multiple solid journeymen. That's a hell of a draft. And finally, the Washington Commanders, 1981. When you think of those 80s Redskins teams, oops, I said a naughty word. When you think of those 80s Redskins teams when they won 3 Super Bowls in a 10-year span, you think of the Hogs. You think of their offensive line. And that's in this draft, that's where they got 2 of the Hogs, Mark May and Russ Grimm. Russ Grimm is in the Hall of Fame. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler and a 3-time first-team All-Pro. Mark May was a Pro Bowler, but it wasn't just that. Dexter Manley was a defensive end. He was an All-Pro player that they drafted in the 5th round and a Pro Bowler. Charlie Brown, no, not the cartoon. He was a 2-time Pro Bowler at wide receiver. Darryl Grant and Clint Didier were also contributors to some of their Super Bowl teams as well. If you want to know why Washington was one of the best teams in the NFL in the 80s, a good place to start looking would be the 1981 draft.